I didn't know that there were Ethernet cables in this place.
No.
I'm just kidding.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us again for another webinar coming from sunny Palo Alto, California at Apogee's World Headquarters. We're today going to talk about OData and how that might relate to design of an API. As always, I just want to quickly mention we've got the API Craft Google group, really big group now, lots of great conversation. Any topics that we don't get a chance to cover today, and any questions we don't get a chance to answer today, please feel free to go onto that group and ask questions from about 1,000 members on there. So I'm sure you'll get some great answers. We also have the YouTube channel. It's just youtube.com/Apogee. All these webinars get posted up there, plus a lot of other good stuff. And we appreciate your feedback and comments on those videos also. And we put the slides up on SlideShare. So that's slideshare.net/Apogee. You can find all the slides from all of our webinars. So what we're going to cover today is we'll do the introductions here. We're going to cover a little primer on OData, or a primer if you're overseas. We're going to do how this affects your API design. We're going to talk a little bit about the community and the adoption of OData. And then, of course, we'll wrap up at the end. So, as always, I'm Brian Pagano, and I am very excited about this session because I am not an OData expert. I have not had a chance to use it much, and I am joined by a couple of some of the sharpest technologists that I have the privilege to know. So I'm very excited to learn along with some of you some of the ins and outs of OData. So on my right, I have Greg Braille.
Hey there.
And on my left, I have Anand Jingran.
Hello.
Excellent. I hope that talkative throughout the entire session. So, Anand, you want to walk us through a little bit, for those out there who are like me, who maybe don't have a great context for OData, you want to walk us through a little bit of it and help us understand?
Absolutely. So before we do that, Brian, before we get to OData, I just want to talk a bit about data in general. And everybody within the enterprises that our audience is in, for example, understands that data is a very important currency. But typically people have viewed data as the data that enterprise that they are in collects, whether they collect it in their CRM system, in their ERP system, or their point of sale systems, or whatever else it is. In general, enterprises have built good practices around consuming and understanding the data that they collect.
Sure.
But the trend that's happening is that the edge of the enterprise is shifting. We have talked a lot about it in our previous webinars. Mm-hmm. The app model is taking off. People are interacting. What exactly is the boundary of your enterprise, right? Is it on your firewall? Is it at your physical store, right? Is it around the apps that somebody has built using your APIs? Is it on your Facebook page? Where exactly is the boundary of your enterprise? And once you start thinking like that, then you immediately realize that data, which still remains an extremely important currency for you, has to be thought slightly differently than it has been thought before. Importantly, you've got to collect data that you're not collecting before, and equally importantly, you've got to expose data that you've not been exposing before. Okay? So today, what we want to talk about is, in this context of data as the new currency, as the edge of the enterprise is expanding, what role do one particular data protocol plays? So some of you might be saying, yeah, we are not really a data company, and therefore, why should we at all worry about collecting data, or why should we worry about exposing data? And Sam has talked a lot about this concept of information halo, that it actually in the end doesn't matter what you do. In the end, either you are in the business of delivering and consuming data, or you are in the business of running more transactions. But in either of those two businesses, exposing data, creating an information halo, creating the attractiveness of your core offerings by exposing data still become an extremely important tenet for your enterprise. So either way, either your data is your core business or transactions is your core business, but you still, in both of those environments, you still have to expose data. And what we'll talk about is what does it mean to expose data through clean APIs.
And you think this applies equally across all verticals?
it applies equally across all verticals.
So everyone, a manufacturing company,
Ab-
supply.
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So you will say, yeah, okay. Exposing data, what is it? It's we all know this term called CRUD, and exposing data is just the R part of CRUD. And yeah, sure, you can do some C's and U's and D's out there, but really, if all people are interested in reading CRUD, we have done day in and day out. But in this new world, if you think about the world of APIs, the problem is that I've used the E/A, you either have a mess of data or you have a mass of data. Okay? And how do you actually expose that mess or the mass through clean APIs? That is the topic that all of us, all of you who are interested in exposing data, either because data is your core business or because data is an information halo around your core business, you guys have to think through. Now, in that world, then, there are really two ways. There may be maybe 10 ways, but I like to keep things relatively simple. Brian and Greg, there are two ways of looking at data. There are people like us, like me, who have grown in the world of schema. And we think about data as having schema, and yes, you can have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 different collections of relatively constant schemas. And you've got kind of some relationships there. And then in that world, you can think about what does it mean to provide REST APIs. And obviously, it's not as clean as this, but in general, the model is a schema model. And then on the right is the linked data model, which says, no. A collection of objects per se, or the schema that a collection of objects carries, is not very relevant. It is the links, the graphs, it is a translation of the web into the data world that really reflects the world of the data, right? And then the question is, therefore, what are the linked data, RDF-centric APIs that can be provided on top of this linked data so that people can access and traverse and other things. So today, I would avoid, for the discussion today, though of course I've talked about it in the past, Brian, on my relative views with respect to the left or the right, okay? We can have that discussion on Google Craft, but I don't want to lose half our audience. Okay? So we'll stick with, if your worldview is the worldview on the left, what is it that you need to do to RESTify access to your data? So that is where comes in this protocol called OData, and it's a specification. It really is what are the best practices, and what is the way to actually RESTify collection of objects and 1:n or 1:m relationships between those collections of objects.
Okay.
So we're going to look at OData requests and responses. So one of the things we did, if you took a look at the OData spec, and we said, hey, if you're used to doing things in SQL, what will this look like in OData? Now this requires a little bit of an intro to OData. But using OData, you register a service. It's actually called the data service, and it has a base URL, which I didn't put in the slides, but it's like, your server / something.svc is usually what it's called.
Okay.
Which in and of itself is not my favorite thing in the world. I would like to not have that, but that is part of the spec. Underneath that is basically collections of resources. And those collections of resources can be queried and also modified using HTTP verbs against URIs in a way very similar to the types of APIs that we usually talk about in this group.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds very similar to another methodology that we talk about quite frequently.
What we had been calling pragmatic REST or modern web APIs or, immature REST. No, only kidding. But that's what we talk about a lot, is the style of APIs that are predominant on the web and that I think developers find it easier to use. So for instance, leaving off the prefix, which is this request, this service name, if I just want to do a select from products where the primary ID is 1, I just do products (1).
As opposed to Greg products/1.
Yep, I got a slide on that later.
Okay, very good, fantastic.
So for instance, if my product's name was, instead of 1, it was, Anand Jingran,
yes,
I would put products, Anand Jingran.
I'm a product. Wow.
A product, right?
Wow, man, I have to be that famous
It is the 21st
for me to have
a
branding of individual people. Fantastic.
We did not specify the price, however.
Absolutely, man.
So that first line is a primary key query. We can also do more sophisticated queries. For instance, here I said, name equals milk. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm doing a SQL kind of request where I'm querying for an arbitrary field in the data. And we'll get into a little bit about the filter syntax later. I can, of course, decide to only retrieve certain fields. That's what the select syntax is for. I can order using order by. I can basically limit, what portion of the result set I get back using top and skip. And the other thing I can do that's kind of interesting because it doesn't map as directly to SQL is OData does have a concept of nested relations. And in a lot of modern web APIs, we've seen that sometimes you want to get, just a list of the names of the products. Sometimes you actually want to extend them and get the details. Or you want to get a list of orders and you want to get order details. In a REST API, what people will often want to do is get back one JSON object, for instance, that includes a list of orders and the order details within the list. So that's what the expand syntax does.
God, that's very clever, actually.
So what I have on the left is actually not the correct SQL to do that.
It's okay.
It's actually not really an SQL concept. SQL returns you, a list of tuples, no matter what you do, right? Whereas what this actually gives you back is it gives you back nested data. So that solves a problem that we API designers often have. Imagine that you have a collection of products, and then we have a collection of prices, and every product has a set of prices. We're always finding ourselves asking the question, if I do a get on /products, do I get the prices for each product, or do I just get the thing? What the expand syntax does is it says, if you include this, for each product, include as a nested resource the prices, and I'm sorry I didn't put an example in. So that's a very interesting and standard way to handle this common API design use case, which is now that I have nested resources, how does the client decide whether they want to expand that list or not? And it doesn't map directly to SQL. So
But do you know what we'll do though is I'll give it to you group by, right? And at least you'll get.
and actually, yeah.
Yes. So.
And I'm not sure if I think there might be a group by OData. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'd have to look that up. So we can move on to the next slide, and I'll do a few more examples. So here's an example of the filters. The filters are extremely powerful. They're very SQL-like. One of the things about OData is that any collection of objects in OData can be filtered in fairly sophisticated ways. And here's a sort of a summary of the syntax. We're not going to go over it, but it's like a SQL where clause. So, that is, again, all names where the sum of the price and the zip code is less than the mod of 2 or whatever, you can do in OData. Very interesting, very powerful, very much like SQL over HTTP.
Is this the complete set, or is this just the most useful
I'm
pieces?
sure there's more.
Yeah, okay, these are the useful bits. All right, got it.
You can also request different formats. There's a there's a dollar format option. One of the things you'll notice in OData is that the OData team selected that for all system parameters, they start with a $sign. You can also have custom parameters that don't start with a $sign. Again, that's a little bit of an unusual choice. There are very few other APIs that actually have this $sign in there, but that's what they've chosen to do.
Okay.
So we can move on from there. One last thing about OData, and it's pretty important, is that if you get your service description URL, your service URL, and you issue the path dollar metadata, you get back an XML doc that looks like that. And that is a summary, and it gets a lot longer. The point of this is not to look at the schema of this XML doc, but the point of it is that by using this metadata concept, you can now build tools that automatically query the OData. So for instance, you can have a plugin on an Excel spreadsheet that you type in the base URL of your OData service, and it will automatically populate the spreadsheet with data from the database or
awesome.
from the service that provides the OData. So kind of the cool thing about OData is that it gives you a pragmatic REST-like way of querying and manipulating collections of resources. And it also gives you a standard metadata format that offers as a description. It doesn't just describe these are the names of the resources and these are the URLs to get them. It actually describes the data format themselves. Now, this is part of the OData standard, which is good. Not everybody uses the OData standard, which is, makes it a little more difficult. But that's an interesting concept because it means that tools can introspect your data in interesting ways.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting.
So, libraries that use OData, and this is where we have, I think, a picture coming up, but there are actually a reasonable number of clients and servers for OData. They're out there for a whole lot of things. Probably the most common use case for OData that I've seen are plugins that run on app servers that connect to databases. And in fact, some databases themselves support OData directly. So that it's possible to basically install an OData connector on your database, and now you can essentially query and manipulate your data with any compliant OData client.
Okay.
You can, of course, because OData we described before, the metadata and all that kind of stuff, that's pretty complicated. You're probably not going to write your own code to handle that. But anybody can write an API that does a get on a collection resource and gets a particular, or orders it, or uses those various URLs we talked before. Those, like any other pragmatic REST style API, can be used by any client. You don't have to have a special client library to use OData. I think where the built-in client would be useful is if you want to take advantage of the metadata and you want to automatically generate code, or you want to automatically generate a UI for your data.
Okay, that makes
The
sense.
server side's a little more complicated, because if you're going to implement OData, you got to implement the whole thing. I mean, at least if you're going to claim to support OData. And if you want clients to be able to discover your data, you've got to serve up the metadata and all that stuff. So supporting OData without using a server-side library that supports OData is a little different. It makes a little bit less sense, right?
Okay.
So basically, if you want to use OData and you want to expose OData, you do have to get some OData code to run on your server. If you want to use OData, you can use a client if you want to automatically generate a UI, or you can just go at it like any other API.
Okay, that makes sense. And what we're seeing out in the wild is that a couple of these flavors are far more prevalent than others, right?
Yes.
So it's good that there's a multitude
Right.
available, but a lot of it
Right.
would be on the.
There is a lot more OData stuff available for the Microsoft family of products than for anything else.
Right. Okay.
So beyond the availability, of course, which doesn't quite come across in these boxes, right? It's also the currency, right? And how much of optimization exists in that code.
Yes.
What is right? And my nagging suspicion is that the really current and the really optimized ones have a Redmondish flavor on them.
I believe that they do.
Right? And so that brings us to the
Okay, so next question. What is, when you read about OData, as I think Brian pointed out, when you start to do research on it, you end up reading about over and over again about WCF. WCF is the Windows Communication Foundation. It's the part of .NET in the Windows stack that does web service messaging. OData is all over that. You can use OData without using any Microsoft technology whatsoever. However, at the moment, the majority of OData implementations on the client and server side are part of the Microsoft stack. So for instance, SQL Azure, the cloud-hosted SQL database by Microsoft, one of the flavors it supports is OData. Just out of the box, if you have a database, OData is enabled. There is a couple of plugins for Excel that manipulate OData. So if you have Excel and SQL Azure, you can use OData under the covers and it all magically happens, and that's great. If you, like most of our readers, have Linux, MySQL, and PHP, there are OData tools out there, but they're not currently, don't seem to be as widely adopted or as widely used as the stuff for the Microsoft technology. So the big question for OData is it going to grow beyond the world of Microsoft?
So I think that we have got this challenge, right, where the structure is quite good, the concepts are quite good, but it is so caught up in the gravitational pull of Microsoft, and that I think is the biggest issue facing the OData world.
Right, so that's the question, and we deliberately tried to make the first part of this not about OData is a thing from Microsoft, that X. Because as soon as you say X is a thing from Microsoft, there's a portion of the community that just doesn't want to listen anymore. And that's not really fair. If you look at the specifics of the specification and the technology, it's got some weirdnesses to it, and we're going to talk about those later. But it does a pretty powerful thing in a very straightforward way that has no specific Microsoft stuff in the protocol itself.
Exactly.
So the question is, can the community around OData expand beyond people who know what WCF stands for and know how to use it, to the larger community of people who don't know what that is.
Correct. And if you go back, Brian, just to finish that point, if you go back to the slide, what that means then is that under the assumption that OData satisfies the needs for a lot of people exposing data, that we want very active participation and development of the boxes which are on the right that are not Microsoft boxes. Once we get parity, Greg and my belief is that the core concepts are fantastic, that people will then leverage and build upon this environment. But the tooling in order to build, as well as the tooling to consume, has to be much more open.
Okay, that was a very clear statement then. So the ideas are great, but until the tooling is available for a wider swath of the technology stack that a lot of folks are using, it's probably not going to get the kind of adoption it deserves.
Yep.
Right.
Fair.
So, for instance, I don't see on the right a way to plug OData into a Cassandra database. Now, the data structures are a little better. Cassandra is not strictly relational, but it has a schema. It has relations. It has a query mechanism. You could build an OData, and maybe there's one out there. But I think we're seeing MySQL being probably the dominant thing in the customer segment that we work with. But we're seeing a growing adoption of NoSQL technologies.
Right.
Even NoSQL technologies, whatever that means. NoSQL meaning not a relational database technologies that have query languages and have schemas that could support OData. Right. So how would that happen? So
Right. And the descriptor that you used, was it Microsoftness or Microsoftiness?
Softiness.
Microsoftiness.
I hope all my Microsoft friends don't come out and shoot me after this. But yes.
You're such a Microsoftie.
All right, and so we were just kind of leaning into this conversation here about who is using it. Do we have any sense of the community out there that's using it?
So a couple of things. So some of the big vendors like SAP and others have announced
They've adopted OData
Right.
in a big way.
they have adopted OData in a big way. So that itself goes a relatively long way, right? With respect to that, some applications that are sitting on top of the data, you can actually access that through OData protocol and others, right? We know this, that at the other extreme of, if you think about SAP as at the core of the enterprise, at the other extreme, if you think about somebody like Netflix, that they have exposed some of their movie catalogs and others through OData, right? But if you really say that, is this a mass movement yet outside the Microsoft world? The answer right now is no.
Okay, that was also very clear. And I think
Yeah.
by this
We
point,
already said this, but we were trying to hold it off until the middle of the presentation. It comes from Microsoft. The OData spec, it has been created through Microsoft, through a Microsoft open source process. It's now being turned over to OASIS, which is the standards body for XML, which means IBM is going to join. Now, Microsoft and IBM together, when they get involved in standards that involve XML, things get complicated. So, good news is it's moving to a very open standards body that's not a subsidiary of Microsoft. Bad news is it's moving to a very open standards body that produces very large and complicated technology. So, how do we keep this from going off the rails and turning into SOAP 3.0?
Pardon my pun, by having one implementation that is on Rails.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I actually don't know if there's a Ruby on Rails.
No, but if I may just make a comment here, there's a difference between whether it has come out of Microsoft or whether it is supported only by Microsoft
Yes.
tools.
Yes, those are.
And I
important
think
points.
that if the community can separate the two, I think the latter is more important than the former.
And also, is the standard going through an open enough standards process that 5 years down the road, Microsoft won't be suing somebody for using OAuth as some companies have done with other technologies? So I think the OASIS is a good step in that direction.
got it. Yeah, when we discussed that earlier, you mentioned that seems a positive direction. So for that slice of the population that was holding off because they're not sure if it's open enough.
Yeah, I think OASIS is going to help a lot with that.
Okay, excellent. All right, so now we come to continuing the discussion of how does OData compare to some other approaches.
So here's a slide I put together to say, hey, if I were designing this API from scratch and I had a collection of objects called products and I wanted to query by primary key, I would probably do products/1. I probably wouldn't do parentheses1 or parentheses single quote a non-jingren with a space that has to be URL encoded anyway in the middle of it, right? If I had to do a filter, okay, that's a very simple filter, but name equals milk is similar than having to type in a SQL where clause. Select is a little interesting. Things like order by, yeah, I'd probably call it order by. Top and skip, yeah, top and skip, offset versus limit, start versus count. Opinions differ about that. The expand thing is pretty cool. So I think that it's just a little different from the way a lot of us who have been designing web APIs would do them if we were starting from scratch. And I think there are good reasons for some of them. I know inside the parentheses you can have fairly complex expressions. SAP has actually extended OData and put like a whole SQL statement in there, which is not my favorite, but that's been doing. At the same time, people have also done things with, there's also this $ business, right? It's weird. In fact, I swear to God, the first time I saw an OData query, I had to actually remind myself that it's okay to have a $ in a URL as part of a query parameter. It's actually syntactically correct, but I had to think about it. And I understand the reason for it. The reason for it is because the $ denotes that's an OData standard parameter versus a custom parameter. And I understand that, but it does make the API, there's a little bit of cognitive barrier that I have to get through as a developer. Oh, right, it's dollar filter, it's not filter. It's dollar order by, it's not order by. That's a little funny.
Oh, it's interesting you brought that up because when I saw the $ in there, I actually asked myself, is that a legal character to have in there? All right.
And the OData people know about this. They've had it for a while. It's it's out there. It's working. It meets the needs. It's just it's a little bit of a different style. That's all.
Okay.
So compared to observed API patterns on the web, OData is very similar.
Yep.
It doesn't, violate any principles by whatever principles you live by, but it is a little different. That's all.
Okay. A little different. That doesn't sound too bad.
Not the end of the world. It does send a signal as soon as you look at the URL. Oh, this API uses OData, for better or for worse.
Right, and that might not be a bad thing.
Right.
Why would that be a good thing?
That you can instantly tell that it's OData.
Yeah, you should inspect the metadata to know this.
Fair enough. I defer to your expertise. And
No, I'm just. What is the purpose of not having?
The ideal would be that it's a really, really easy to use API that follows the patterns we all know and love that people can quickly learn how to use. And if they want to, because they have an OData compliant client that can introspect on the API, I know that if I put $metadata in this API, I get a big XML doc, and now I can do more stuff with it. That to me would be kind of the ideal, is that you don't have to know it's OData unless you want to know that it's OData.
Got it.
You don't have to know, I am now creating an OData request, it's going to be really complicated. It shouldn't be that bad, because you've seen the basic patterns. They're really very simple.
Okay. And do you guys want to make any comments on how it compares against like SOAP or GData?
SOAP will leave SOAP to people who bathe regularly. GData is I think that GData is much more. I kind of view it more on kind of content publishing side of the world as opposed to structured data and class publishing and other things. So it kind of attacks a slightly different class of problems. Though of course people will go blue in their face and assert that it can do everything that OData does. And in fact, when I browse the Wikipedia entry for GData, it does say it competes with OData protocol and others.
But I haven't seen an instance of anybody using GData other than Google.
Yeah.
So it's more Google than OData is Microsoft.
Yeah, it is not M data, it was OData.
Right.
Right.
Whereas GData is really. It seems to be something that basically is a Google service. I will say that there's also an interesting contrast to be made between OData and the hypermedia style API discussion that a lot of people have been having, actually for 10 years. But in that In theory, if if the resources that come back from the API contain enough links in them, you can discover the API without the need for a separate metadata document. And I think there's something to be said for having an API like OData that contains that links, so you can discover the data if you want. I don't believe the links should be random numbers or anything. I know I've heard some people advocate for that, but I think there's something to be said for that. However, the OData metadata is in one place. It describes the whole API, and not only the structure of the links, but it describes the structure of the data as well, and that's the most important thing. Because if you're building a UI that's going to run off a generic OData service and not know anything about the data beforehand, it's got to not only know these are the names of the collections, but these are the names of all the fields and what type they are and how to display them.
I see.
Have descriptors in various languages, so on and so forth. But if all you want to do is discover what are the names of the collections, you could imagine that you would query a collection and it would include some metadata which has got some links in it to sub-collections or links that you would use to post and create, which is pretty interesting.
And again, we've kind of leaned into this part of this question earlier in the discussion, which is how active is community support?
Right.
Echoing what I think I heard earlier was that there is some out there, but it is not a very widely adopted methodology at this point.
Mm-hmm.
That's critical.
It's not widely adopted at this point.
Right.
And it's not, our best guess is not a widely, both adoption but also active in terms of contributions and tooling and other things.
But that can change.
Right.
Which begs this question. So is it time? And it sounds like, Greg, from the stuff you were just talking about, that there are some very good things here.
Yeah, and then I think the next question is I'm more thoughtful about, but on this particular question, it's definitely not too early, right? I mean, we have seen patterns of API design on the web that are based around URIs. We have seen ways in which people structure APIs, in which common patterns have emerged that developers can understand. For the most part, OData follows those patterns, despite the dollar signs. And it is something that people can use now. So I don't think it's too early. And I think that if a standard, standards are complicated. Certainly a convention were to be formulated for making APIs like this, it would make it a lot easier to learn and use them.
And I feel that, I'm slightly biased, Greg, you know this, but the kind of the data dialogue today has devolved into a big data technology dialogue, right?
Mm-hmm.
How big is your data?
Yeah.
How much, whether you use Cassandra 08 or whether you use Cassandra 1.0 or whether HBase will solve the right problem and all that. So it's become a very technology-centric dialogue. And what people have forgotten is that the real issue is data, not the technology that operates on top of the data.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a real shift that's happening, it will happen over the course of the next couple of years, where people who are sitting on top of the data will reassert control, as opposed to people who are sitting on top of technology that manipulates data. And therefore, this sounds about the right time for the data part to come back into the vernacular and dialogue and web dialogues and others. And therefore, it sounds about right for us to start rallying around a set of APIs around data, forgetting the technology of manipulating the data and others, which is typically what big data stuff have talked about.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. So not too early. We should be looking to rally around something like this. So that being said, if I were starting a project today, should I use OData?
I have very mixed feelings about this. Because on the one hand, if you have a schema with data in it, and you expose it through OData, you've now automatically followed some patterns that are very consistent and other people will understand. And people can point things at it like Excel and start browsing your data, which is great. On the other hand, naked OData is kind of like putting your SQL database on the internet and opening up the firewall port to the world and saying, go ahead, log in and start shooting SQL commands at it.
Right.
Right? So there need to be layers in between that restrict what people can do. This is the old classic, do I allow ad hoc queries on my transactional data store problem that people have been talking about for 100 years or whatever.
100, right.
30, right? So it's the same kind of thing, right? I mean, if you're going to allow people to make up complex queries using the OData filter syntax, and I'm sure the OData people have been through this discussion before, but if you're going to expose OData as part of an API, you really got to. That doesn't necessarily mean exposing your entire relational database schema or your entire Cassandra schema or whatever to the world as OData. It means you're going to expose some limited subset to keep yourself out of trouble.
Okay.
Now, the other point that I'll add here, Greg, is that take a look at, for example, companies that have built software that is what I would call data-centric,
Mm-hmm.
applications that are data-centric. Salesforce, for example, comes to mind very clearly. Salesforce, at the very bottom layer, uses relational technologies. But at the top, there's a concept of customer objects.
Yes.
Right? There are customers, there are sales, there are orders, there are pipelines. They're all kind of business objects, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't have to devolve all the way down to the relational layer for you to think about OData-like mechanisms around these concepts of business objects. And I feel that there is a much larger community of applications out there that are operating at that business objects level that, for example, could benefit from this.
Mm-hmm. So I certainly don't think one should expose the raw OData API. On the other hand, I've used, for instance, database.com, right? If they had used OData, perhaps it would be easier to learn their API. I'd have to remember to put in the dollar signs, but that's a fairly minor point, right? Now maybe it doesn't apply to them or whatever. So I'd like to see a few changes maybe, and I'd like to see some way to proxy the API you expose to prevent out-of-control OData clients. You need to decide what, just like in an API, you don't poke your internal web services out to the internet and give everybody access to everything you can do. You actually put in a layer in between to control exactly what gets exposed to different kinds of clients based on who they are. You have to have the same thing for OData.
All right, so it sounds like that's the secret here. You put in an architecturally
Right.
speaking, you put in a layer in front of it
Right.
like you would for anything else.
Yeah.
It just happens that it's exposed in a very consumable way.
Yeah.
Got it.
Now, does it apply to all APIs? Of course not. But APIs that have fairly complex structures of data that you want to be able to the Netflix movie database is a great example. eBay is a great example of something where OData would make sense. Browsing and filtering a large catalog in complex ways. Why invent your own API? Once you've put in select, filter, count, sort by, why not support OData, even if it's a separate flavor of your API, rather than have to invent all that stuff on your own.
All right.
So if I can go back to one of the questions, not questions, a comment that was posed which said, oh, by the way, I guess because of this OSS expansion, Microsoft, SAP, IBM, Progress, and quite a few others are signing on to OData.
Right.
When I look at it, it's exciting for the OData community. But you know what I find really missing in that? That in the end, APIs are for the consumers, not for the providers.
Right.
Right? So the question is this: where is the community of the people who represent the consumption side as opposed to the providing side? Now, what will happen is some of the people who are in that list will provide tools to consume.
Sure.
Right? So in IBM's rational tools, if IBM supports it, a community of OData providers is really not a community of OData providers. It's a community of companies that will provide tools that will ODatafy other people's data sources.
So what's missing is the users.
And they will again provide tools for consumption, for example. But are you really going to consume OData through tools that other people are going to provide? Or are you going to consume OData in your native iOS app that you're going to write? Right? And you're going to actually consume it, right? So what I really worry about is the following, that it is again very enterprisey OData perspective among the people who are participating for enterprise use cases,
Yes.
right? And the real game or real shift is the long tail in data production and the long tail in data consumption. That is where OData will actually really take off, as opposed to within the enterprise boundary, yet another mechanism for people to
Right.
actually mix and match.
This is yet another attempt at having a generic SQL.
Yet another,
for a generic protocol for relational databases.
which I didn't.
Yeah.
Luckily, I never got out of the SQL mindset, so I never
Right.
jumped somewhere else.
Right.
So that is my concern. So I think that as a community, we have to. There's nothing wrong with it, but we have to jump in and assert. If OSS is it, I don't know what the mechanism says. We've got to participate. But equally importantly, people have to, all the tools that help provide OData have to come out from the control of large enterprise software vendors, because most of them will be paid tools or part of larger concepts, right? So the thing that I really want to implore the community on is that people need to get involved in the appropriate Node and Ruby on Rails and Python and Jetty and other projects that will actually help produce OData. And then we want people to consume OData in the context of their writing their apps, as opposed to through tools, which will
Right.
again be provided by large enterprise vendors.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think that one measure of OData's success would be that if some popular APIs started to provide OData, but that the clients didn't know that unless they wanted to. It's not, so I mean, that's something to think about. Right now, I'm not sure how to do that, but I think that that would be the ideal situation, because obviously, when you've got a developer building a mobile app, they're probably not going to want to download the metadata, and they're probably not going to care. It'd be cool if they had a button they could push in their development tool that would generate a client for your API, but that's about it.
Okay, let's go through some of the. We're kind of done with the structured part of the.
Yep.
I believe so. This
Yep.
is a great time
Yes.
to take some questions. We've had a few come in from the audience. The first one was around, what would be the implications for using OData as far as it affects UI development with frameworks such as Dojo or Sencha? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think any of those frameworks are actually capable yet of understanding the OData metadata. But certainly from any framework, you can make OData API calls, because you don't need to have the metadata in order to use an OData-based API.
And what is returned is a JSON tuple,
JSON or XML.
right? Okay, JSON or XML. What's returned, and all of these tools are capable of consuming.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then what happens, I think some of the things is that supposing you've got a nested relational stuff that's coming around, right? Again, as part of my JSON structure, that's not an issue at all, right? So the real issue is that whether the tools can actually query the metadata, right? And
Yeah.
make programmatic actions, as opposed to actions that are coded by the application developer.
Right, I think the interesting thing would be if UI tools, you just simply type in a URL and it would generate a UI. Now, this gets into our old code generation, how to avoid the RPC 5.0 syndrome that I always like to talk about, but I think that it's really important to keep the protocol simple enough so that it's not required it's not required for anyone to generate code on the client side. It's great that you can. In some environments, that'll be really awesome. I think if we get back into a world in which your API no longer works, then, DCE was fine, and we should just go back to it. It was a lot more efficient than this stuff anyway.
Okay.
Didn't you spend some time at Transart?
I was Mr. DCE.
Oh
man.
yeah! Oh my
Yeah.
God!
I was
I-
Mr.
I-
trying to use DCE. is what
Okay,
was.
I got
was
it.
even harder.
I got it.
Anyway.
All right, great. So we have another question about, we discussed a little bit earlier about that $ syntax.
Yeah.
And so there were, just a question about, custom query criteria or extending supported
Yep.
parameters.
You
So-
can extend it. You can use it to invoke services, which is cool. And that's actually really nice, because in the traditional HTTP URL world, we have CRUD, right? Get, put, post, delete, and some kind of update verb, depending on who you talk to. It's nice sometimes to be able to do, buy, sell, whatever. So OData gives you a way to extend that, which is cool. One of the nice things I really like about OData is that it does give you standards for how to do things like ordering and filtering and pagination. So the fact that you can add custom parameters is also nice and important, but the real value of OData, I think, is in those standard parameters.
Yeah. Okay. But you can do it if you need to.
You can do that too.
Okay, I think that was most of the questions that we had. All right, well, we're just about out of time. So if anyone thinks of any questions or there's anything we couldn't get to during the call here, please feel free to go onto the API Craft Google group and pose your questions there. And I want to thank everyone for sticking with us. And I want to thank Greg and Anant for joining me in this discussion. I learned a lot.
Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, thanks everyone.
Okay.
Have a great
Thanks.
day.
Bye.